War had finally gone silent. For days, the echo of gunfire had been replaced by the sound of boots on broken streets and the distant hum of engines. In a small village outside Frankfurt, people were still afraid to come out. The rumor was that the Americans had arrived, and no one knew what that truly meant. Clara stood at the doorway of her family's damaged farmhouse, clutching her little brother's hand. "They're here," whispered a neighbor from across the road. A convoy rolled in, massive trucks with white stars, engines rumbling like thunder. To Clara, they looked like something from another world. The soldiers who stepped down were tall, dressed in neat uniforms with strange smiles. For years, the only Americans she'd seen were in propaganda posters, drawn like monsters or shadows. But these men looked human, tired but human. One of them waved awkwardly. "Hello there," he said, his accent strange and warm. Nobody answered. Then came a moment that changed everything. A soldier reached into his pack and tossed something shiny toward the children. A chocolate bar. Clara froze. Real chocolate. She hadn't seen any in years. Her brother darted forward, snatched it, and broke it in half, sharing it with her without a word. The soldier smiled. "See, not so scary." Behind them, the rest of the Americans began unloading supplies. Bread, canned goods, blankets. It wasn't what the villagers expected. Some of the women whispered. "They're giants," half in fear, half in disbelief. Others laughed nervously at how tall they were, joking quietly to themselves that even the smallest of them looked like movie heroes. Clara didn't laugh. Not yet. She watched carefully as two soldiers helped rebuild a broken bridge over the nearby stream. Their sleeves rolled up, muscles straining, voices filled with laughter. "They're not angry?" she asked softly. For neighbor, Frau Meyer, shrugged. "Maybe they don't need to be anymore." By sunset, curiosity began to win over fear. The Americans had set up a temporary kitchen near the square. The smell of food, real food, drifted through the air. One brave boy, no older than 10, approached with a bowl in hand. "Please," he asked in broken English. The soldier, serving, smiled. "Sure thing, buddy." By nightfall, the whole village had come out. Children chased after the soldiers' jeeps. Women whispered in amazement at their gadgets. And the old men stood by, still suspicious, but no longer terrified. Clara finally stepped closer, her brother clinging to her side. "Thank you," she said, her accent heavy but clear. The tall American bent down slightly to understand her better. "You're welcome," he said, grinning. He handed her a piece of bread and winked. That night, Clara sat by the window, watching the glow of the American campfires outside the village. The sound of laughter drifted through the cool spring air. English words, mixing with German ones, hesitant but real. Realized for the first time that maybe the world was changing, not through weapons, but through kindness. And when her brother whispered, "Do you think they'll stay?" she smiled faintly. "Maybe for a while," she said. "Long enough for us to remember what peace feels live." The next morning, the village woke to a strange sound music. Not the solemn march they were used to, but something lively, cheerful, bouncing through the crisp air. It came from one of the American trucks parked near the square. Clara followed the tune, curious. The song was in English, something about sunshine and a beautiful day. The melody made people smile without understanding the words. For Brother Max laughed, mimicking the beat with a stick on a tin can. Even Frau Meyer, who rarely smiled since her husband died, found herself tapping her foot. One of the soldiers, Private Daniel, noticed. "You like jazz?" he asked, his voice warm. Clara frowned, trying to understand. He pointed to the radio, swaying a little. "Music. Jazz. Jaw music," she replied hesitantly. Then, for the first time in years, she laughed softly, but it was real. Daniel laughed too, relieved. By midday, the Americans had turned the village square into a small relief camp. They cooked, repaired roofs, handed out supplies. The children watched in awe as the soldiers used large machines and tools they had never seen before. "They build like magicians," said one boy. The humor began quietly. Some women joked about how tall the soldiers were, comparing them to the church tower. "Look at them," one whispered, giggling. "If they sneeze, our rooftops will fall." Even the soldiers joined in on the laughter, not understanding all the words, but feeling the lightness. Clara noticed how Daniel always tried to learn simple German phrases. Danke, he'd say proudly, after every exchange. When she corrected his pronunciation, he'd grin. I'll get it right, eventually. One afternoon, as they were serving food, a soldier offered a plate to Clara and said, with a smile, "That's meatballs and spaghetti." She looked at him blankly. The words unfamiliar, he repeated. Slower this time. Meatballs. Spaghetti. Clara turned to Max, whispering, "Was Ista's?" "What is that?" The soldier laughed and motioned for her to try it. She hesitated, but took a bite. Her eyes widened. It was warm, rich, full of flavor she had never tasted. "Good?" the soldier asked eagerly. Clara nodded, unable to speak. He chuckled. "See, not bad, huh?" She smiled faintly. "Not bad," she repeated in broken English. The soldiers around laughed cheerfully, clapping their hands. For a moment, the war, the hunger, the grief, all of it seemed far away. The smell of food, the laughter of strangers, and the sound of jazz created something fragile but precious. Peace. That night, Daniel sat near the campfire with a few villagers. He took out a small notebook and showed them a picture of his family back in Chicago. Clara looked at the smiling faces. "Beautiful," she said softly. He pointed at her, and then her brother. "You family?" She nodded. "Only us now." He hesitated, then said, "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment and replied, "You, not enemy." Daniel smiled, eyes reflecting the firelight. "No. Not anymore." From that night onward, the Americans were no longer just giants or occupiers. They were people with fears, hopes, jokes, and kindness of their own. The villagers began calling them the Tall Friends. When Daniel helped Clara fix the broken roof of her farmhouse the next day, she joked, "Good, you are tall enough to reach the sky." He laughed loudly, almost startling her. "Yeah," he said, "comes in handy sometimes." They both laughed again. Not because it was funny, but because it felt good to laugh, and though none of them knew what the future held, one thing was clear. Something had changed in that small village. The tall Americans had not only rebuilt walls, they had started rebuilding hearts. Days passed, and the village began to look alive again. The streets that had once echoed with silence were now filled with footsteps, laughter, and even a bit of music from the American radio. The children followed the soldiers everywhere, learning English words in exchange for wildflowers. Ball. They'd shout, pointing to the fruit. Bread. Thank you. Clara was different now, too. She no longer hid behind her door. Every morning, she'd help Daniel and the others distribute food to families. She had learned to say good morning in English, and Daniel had proudly mastered Guten Tag. Each time he said it, his accent made her giggle. But there were still moments of awkwardness. Once, when an American soldier tried to compliment a villager's bread, he accidentally said something that sounded rude in German. The women gasped, then burst into laughter when they realized his mistake. He laughed until tears came to his eyes, shaking his head. "Guess I'll stick to English," he said, and everyone agreed. The Americans were fascinated by how resilient the villagers were, especially the women. They had kept their homes standing with almost nothing, repaired roofs with scrap metal, and shared every last piece of bread. The soldiers respected that. Some of them even said, "These people are tougher than us." For the villagers, the Americans were a puzzle. They were friendly, loud, and endlessly curious. They took pictures of everything: the church, the old well, the children playing. When one soldier showed them a small portable camera, the entire square gathered around like it was magic. Clara was amazed when he developed a photo right there. It showed her and Max smiling awkwardly. For the first time, she saw herself smiling since before the war. Daniel gave her the picture and said, "To remember peace." She held it tightly, nodding. "Peace," she repeated softly, as if tasting the word for the first time. The evenings, when the soldiers sat by their campfires, the villagers would sometimes join. Someone would play a harmonica, and another would hum an American tune. Slowly, the gap between language and culture began to fade. One evening, the soldiers invited the villagers to share a meal. There was bread, beans, and once again, spaghetti and meatballs. The women couldn't stop laughing at the dish. The long noodles looked so strange, and the soldier's proud way of serving it made it even funnier. Daniel noticed Clara struggling to eat with the fork. "Here," he said, showing her how to twirl it. She copied him, her fingers clumsy, but after a few tries, she managed. "Like this?" she asked, her accent soft but clear. "Perfect," Daniel said with a grin. The table filled with laughter as others tried to. It wasn't a feast, but it felt like one. A celebration of survival, of unlikely friendship. Later, when most had gone to rest, Clara and Daniel remained by the fire. The stars shone bright above the quiet countryside. She asked him, "You miss home?" He nodded slowly. "Every day." She looked into the flames. "Maybe we all miss something, but maybe here we find new." Daniel smiled, surprised by her words. "Yeah," he said, "maybe we do." From that night on, their bond deepened into something unspoken. Not romance, not obligation, but a shared understanding that both had lost too much and found a strange kind of comfort in each other's company. The war had taken their peace, but in this fragile aftermath, they were rebuilding it, one shared meal, one laugh, one kind gesture at a time. And as the days grew warmer, the fear that once hung over the village was replaced by something far rarer: hope. Summer arrived, soft and golden over the valley. The trees were green again. The river ran clear, and for the first time in years, the air smelled of bread, not smoke. The Americans had been in the village for weeks now, long enough for the children to memorize their faces, and the women, too, learn their names. Life had found rhythm again. Laughter during the day, quiet fires at night. Every Sunday, the villagers would bring flowers to the small square, where the Americans played their radio. It was a ritual of peace, one that nobody wanted to end. But soon, news came. Orders had arrived. The American unit would be leaving. The morning the trucks began to line up, silence fell over the village. The women gathered by their doors, children clutching the soldiers' hands, refusing to let go. Clara stood near the well, her brother Max holding the photograph Daniel had given her weeks before. Daniel approached, his uniform freshly pressed, his face tired. "You'll be all right," he said softly. Clara nodded, trying to smile. "We were all right. Because of you." He hesitated, then handed her a small package. Inside was a folded piece of cloth, part of the American flag patch from his sleeve. "For luck," he said. Her eyes filled with tears. "You keep," she whispered. Shook his head. "No," he said gently. "You'll need it more." For a moment, neither spoke. Around them, the trucks roared to life. Men shouting, laughter mixed with sorrow. Daniel looked at her brother and ruffled his hair. "Be good, little man." Max saluted awkwardly, and everyone laughed through their tears. As Daniel climbed into the truck, Clara stepped forward and said, "Danke." For peace. He smiled from the open door. For hope. The convoy began to move, dust rising into the morning light. Children ran beside the trucks, waving until they disappeared over the hill. Then, slowly, the village grew quiet again. But it was not the silence of fear anymore. It was peace. That evening, Clara sat by the same window where, weeks ago, she had watched the Americans' first campfires. Now, the fires were gone, replaced by fireflies over the fields. She took out the small flag patch and pressed it to her heart. Max climbed beside her, whispering, "Do you think they'll come back?" She smiled faintly. "Maybe not," she said. "But they left something that will never leave." "What's that?" She looked out toward the road and whispered. The stars glimmered above them, and for the first time in years, the world didn't feel broken. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Daniel was heading home to his family, his own rebuilt life, and Clara knew that even though they might never meet again, they had shared something that transcended language, country, and war. Humanity. In that moment, she realized the true miracle of peace. It wasn't the absence of war. It was the courage to trust again, to laugh again, to see strangers as people, not enemies. And as the night deepened over the quiet German hills, Clara whispered one last word: "Goodbye." But deep in her heart, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning.